Alright, so YouTube is filled with lots and lots of good information. It always is. So, essentially, what happens is they essentially, like in Japan, they have more extreme versions, and that stuff sometimes referred to as China doll. But essentially, the concept is all the same. It really is. So, this is the YouTube video I started watching. It's like a documentary or something. It's called Daddy Dom's in Charge Extreme Love. Okay, so, yeah, right within the first minute, she says that she has to look at him to speak to him. I'll tell you a few reasons why that would be. Based on his appearance, more than likely he's been doing the Satanic Cuckolding Club, and they get fuck raped into dumb schizos, and that's kind of where it ends up kind of deadening their brains. So this eye contact stuff actually is required for the rapist, also, because essentially they'll be disassociating most of the time, and the eye contact has a similar back and forth for the victim who gets raped while the person stares at their fucking eyes and chants like satanic curses and shit. And that then, essentially, they always fuck up and are dumb, and they essentially get punishments in the mastering world that they don't really tell people about that, but they essentially get punishments that kind of dumbs their brain a little bit. Okay, it's like they get a form of rape as their punishment, and it kind of deadens their brain too. It's like if you rape a chick too much, it kind of deadens their brain, and same with these cuckolding dumb masters in FetLife and shit. I mean, there's the same. So, essentially during the rape, most of the time they chant fuck words, which are triggering words back to the shock state. And that they stare in their eyes because essentially it's called satanic sealing, and that it has an effect of this shock state starts to build as a protection altar behind the scenes, and that this triggers them disassociating back to a trained sexual slaving method. And so that trigger, that kind of keeps them from red integrating, basically, in ways. It's one of the triggers that keeps them from red integrating because it constantly reminds them of this moment. And so then also when that stops working, then they start saying satanic sex slaving words. Then they usually switch personalities, or they go into shock most of the time. It's kind of like personality shock. Over time, it'll turn into a personality, but it puts them back in that shock state. And that from that, it essentially keeps them from reintegrating. So that is what pedo, or there's newer definitions to the word pedo sealing, but essentially that's where pedophiles do that at the children, and they do this at the children, and it's essentially referred to as satanic sealing. And that, it fuses the dom's eyes essentially to the shock state. It fuses that. So the whole idea is that there's the way that the chick's acting is essentially the subconscious psychological output of in, childish form of satanic sex slave. See, when they do the satanic sex slaving, they're in a shock state, and they get out of shock, but then it starts to push out in their normal life, and that is what keeping them calling every 2 hours, hearing the voice that gives them like, it kind of keeps them with that. Well, in this chick's case, it's like it keeps her in like a childish kind of way of being. And that is like where the pedophile, that is where at some point she says that it's not sexual, but more than likely, he just says the words, she goes into shock and then doesn't remember being raped and stuff. And that's pretty typical. See, when they act childish and shit. See, the whole idea is that when it comes to a wizard, a witch does that at a wizard. So it'll be like a female victim will do that at a male victim. Basically. And that I don't like that. I don't like that shit. See, that's the kind of shit that like a witch, which is like basically what that chick would fall into my definition of being a witch. They witch at you, right? Where they attempt to fuse. See, that type of stuff is like where victim women will fuse at a wizard. They will. And see, I don't like that shit. Not at all. See, that stuff has a potential for doing similar kind of theoretical ideas. And that's the shit that like I avoid that shit. It's like when yelling at my woman or something, I wouldn't like stare at her or anything. I'd be like, hey, here's logic. Be smart, witch. I mean, that's kind of it. So the whole idea is that if a witch does certain ideas like that at me, that is like a memory trigger to my own childhood, like victimization. So that's where I attempt to avoid. I mean, I look at people in the face, but the moment that they get the witch's eye, basically, and a lot of times the reality is that when they do that stuff, the children end up fusing together, and so that is where then when they do that, then the little boy has to do the master stuff, and that is like where little boys in real reality don't necessarily want to be doing child pornography and shit. And so when a witch does that when a little girl does that at a little boy, that is where then a lot of times the little boy is gaslitted into a belief of needing to do things with the little girl so that they will, because they'll switch and they'll turn into crazy kind of, they will, and that then they teach the little boy to essentially do a child's version of a fuck switching, and that then the little girl goes back to normal. And so that's where I know not to do that, and that I knew that as a kid too, and I wouldn't do that anymore. But then they act real. A lot of times, if it's really progressive satanic sex slaving, they'll act extremely like, see, if unchecked, the little girl witch will eventually grab some knife and stab some little baby and shit. And so when they start, and so these were some of the weird psychological tortures that I was put under, because I would have the ability of making them not do that, but that it was things that I wouldn't necessarily have ever wanted to do as a little boy. But I took like responsibility, and then I started figuring out different ways. No, basically, I I started figuring out different ways to make them kind of snap out of it, because they kind of, it's like a disassociation. They drift into a disassociation, basically, and then they start playing out the trained victimizations that they do over and over again in the same theatrical way they do over and over again. And then essentially what triggers their tender psyche then has them starting to play out all the like sexual kind of porn kind of stuff. And that's where that's where if if I didn't do anything about it, then the pedophiles would start raping them. You see? And so yeah, that's like when the witch gets the sex eyes or something at me, okay, like that's where I attempt to avoid, because if you avoid, then a lot of times they won't switch psychologically. And then they won't start playing out the sexual stuff. So that's essentially just from like 1 minute or so. Here's what I can explain about why somebody would have to look at somebody directly in the eyes, and why somebody would be calling every 2 hours. See, a lot of times these dudes, they don't really understand sometimes that the more blatant and white you get, the more likely that you're a dumb fuck. And dumb fucks are usually rotten pedophiles and rapists.